and welcome to the Green Transition Show with me, Dr. Francis Tuokun. Energy is the lifeblood of modern society. It powers our homes, fuels our industries, drives our economies, and ultimately, it shapes the cost of living for millions of people around the world. Today, we have an important guest to help us find out what the hidden link is between the war in the Middle East and your electricity bill. Our guest is Lom Ahlijah. Lom is a private legal practitioner, a law lecturer, and an energy consultant in Accra, Ghana. Welcome to the show, Lom.
Thank you very much, Doc. I hope you are doing well.
I'm doing well. Good to see you.
Yes, good to see you too.
Can you please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us what you do?
Okay, so as you mentioned, I'm a private legal practitioner in Ghana, managing attorney of Integrity Solicitors and Advocates, which is based here in Ghana. We are a law firm specializing in various aspects of law, including energy law, obviously, and commercial and corporate law. Apart from what I do at the firm, I'm also an academic and a lecturer. I teach at the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration in the law school. And in GIMPA, I teach mainly commercial law and from time to time, legal research and writing, as well as constitutional law. So generally, that's what I do.
Thank you. Viewers, if you are listening to us or watching us for the first time, we ask that you subscribe to the channel, The Green Transition Show. You can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or TikTok to motivate us to continue to bring you very insightful discussions. The war in the Middle East feels distant. It's very far away from many of us. But how exactly does a conflict between countries like Iran and Israel end up affecting the electricity bills of ordinary Ghanaians or ordinary people across the world, not just Ghanaians?
Yes, not just Ghanaians, because this conflict, even though it's in the Middle East, has far-reaching implications for countries all over the globe. But if we want to just situate it in context, looking at Ghana, let's say as a case study, it directly impacts the bottom line for most consumers of power in their homes and businesses and so on. And the reason is because of how electricity is generated and how it is produced. So if you take Ghana, for example, about close to 70%, 70% of our power generation on the national grid comes from thermal resources, which is interesting because at the start of the republic, or when Ghana became a republic in 1960, the main source of production was hydroelectric, but that has switched over time, and now thermal is a dominant generating source, which is powered from fossil fuels. So it either heavy fuel oil or natural gas. Mainly the plants in Ghana are reliant on natural gas, but natural gas is closely associated with oil. And as I'm sure you know, and many of your viewers also would know, natural gas tends to be associated with oil. So long as the conflict persists, it puts pressure on global oil prices. And that's because the conflict is in a place where about a fifth of the oil production in the world goes through, which I'm sure you have heard, and many people have heard, the now infamous Strait of Hormuz. If it was a term or place that people didn't know, now everybody's talking about it. So because that particular place controls the route of about a fifth of global oil production, it automatically puts pressure on global prices of oil. And once oil prices goes up, it directly impacts natural gas as well, and other fossil fuels that are linked with oil. So directly, there's an impact on consumers of power, because once these prices go up, it affects and triggers the need for tariff adjustments and so on. In Ghana, the Public Utility Regulatory Commission is responsible for tariff determination, which they do at least on a quarterly basis for the routine reviews, which means that when global prices go up for oil, natural gas, and other fossil fuels, it will impact directly the bottom line for most consumers because that has to be taken account of by the PURC. It is interesting that in this quarter starting in April, the PURC tariff adjustment actually proposed a reduction for electricity, which is good news for consumers, obviously. But that was because there are many factors that go into the determination. And even though oil prices, or let's say gas prices, had gone up, there was still a reduction because other factors like inflation and foreign exchange rates were better overall. But once we continue to see this conflict going on and the price of oil going up, it is possible that down the line, the consumers will feel the pinch directly in their bills.
So it means that if PURC has proposed for a reduction of tariffs, doesn't mean we are postponing the real impact of the conflict on electricity bills for the future. Are we postponing that the real impact, or what do you think? Given that PURC has proposed a reduction, it means we are only postponing the real impact, isn't it?
I would say no as my primary response. I'll give the explanation. I also say there's a little yes in there. So no, because as I said, in order to determine the tariff for a particular window, which in this case we are talking about on a quarterly basis, the PURC's determination is based not only on the price of oil. Price of oil, price of natural gas is a key factor, but not the only determining factor. They are looking at other things, as I said, for example, dollar to cedi rates at any point in time. They are looking at inflation in the country. They are looking at proposals submitted by the various utilities. They are looking at efficiency standards that they have set and whether utilities are meeting them and so on. So it is a formula that has many variables. So even though the oil price or natural gas price is a key factor or variable in that formula, it is not the only thing to be considered. So in this particular window, they have proposed a reduction because the other things were better. Okay, but as I said, for so long as the prices continue to go up, then it means that at some point the reality will have to be faced, which is why I'm saying that there's a yes in there as well, because it is not completely dependent on just the price of oil. You also know that, at least in the case of Ghana, there's legacy debt and arrears built up from over the years, which because utilities have not been able to pay full cost for power that has been generated and so on, which means that there's also possibility of potential increase in arrears or in terms of the bills which cannot be paid because the utilities have challenges on their finances or government does not have enough allocation in terms of budgetary allocation to cover those arrears as well. So it is a balancing act that the regulator has to undertake at any point in time, looking at all factors before it. So for this quarter, starting 1st April, there is a reduction because, as I said, the other variables were good. But for so long as this conflict continues in the Middle East, the possibility of increase is very real because at the time, for example, at the start of the conflict, oil prices were around about $70 a barrel. Today, it's about $110.
We're having our guests seem to have technical challenges. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. All right. Yes. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Yes. So you were trying to explain the tariff systems in Ghana. So I would like to know how exposed is Ghana's tariff system to international volatilities?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
I want to know how the tariff system in Ghana, I want to know whether it's too exposed to international volatilities.
Absolutely, because as I said, we are a nation, at least in Ghana, that is heavily dependent on thermal.
Yeah.
And thermal, the major input, at least in order to run the plants, is the fuel aspect of it, which means that we are essentially reliant on a generating source, which has a variable that is very volatile. Anything that happens on the global stage that impacts oil prices automatically impacts the cost of running these plants. So it is volatile because it is vulnerable to price shocks. Okay. Assuming, for example, we had a significant portion coming from, say, hydroelectric sources or other renewable sources, then it means that the input fuel will be the sun or water, which is not dependent on necessarily what is happening in the Middle East. But once it is fuel, which is the fossil fuels, which is driven by oil prices and natural gas prices, then it is vulnerable because the impact from global price changes will be felt directly within our country. And so to the extent that we have a significant portion of our electricity generation coming from fossil fuel-based plants, that's thermal plants, then the volatility is quite clear. And as I indicated, we are talking in a region of about 70% of our generation coming from thermal sources. So you can imagine the impact on the sector once prices are changing because of a conflict like what is happening in the Middle East currently.
Right. Viewers, if you are watching us or if you are listening to us, this is the Green Transition Show with me, Dr. Francis Tuokun. Our guest for today's episode is a private legal practitioner, a law lecturer, and an energy consultant. He's Lom Ahlijah. Counsel, I'd like to know, so could this kind of geopolitical shock lead to power outages, or what we call in Ghana, Dumsor, based on what you said so far? Don't you think it will lead to power outages or Dumsor in the near future if it continues?
Yes, if it continues, that possibility is real. It is real because then we will have a situation where the cost of the inputs, the fuel, has become so high that it is pushing or there'll be significant pressure on utilities to pay for that increased cost, which they may not have budgeted for. Because as I mentioned, looking at the increase in price from $70 a barrel to 110, I can assure you that most utilities in their scenario planning from 2025 did not anticipate such a big jump. But let's even say they did anticipate it. Their projections will be a reasonable increase over and above what was pertaining at the time, around $70 a barrel, which means that the continued conflict, if it continues to increase prices on the international markets, which is likely, then it means that it will be completely out of gear with projections that utilities had in mind, which means that it will fundamentally change the equation in terms of how they are prepared for it, because it's all about money. It's about dollars at the end of the day. How do you have the resources to pay for that increase in the price of your input, which is your fuel, driven by this conflict? So it is possible down the line that could happen if utilities are not able to cover the cost of increase in prices, and, for example, government is not able to. For now, we don't see, or at least for now, we don't see any real possibility of that, because, as I said, between the first quarter and the second quarter, at least in the context of Ghana, prices have actually reduced. But once the trajectory continues, it will become inevitable that there will be increase in the tariff, and also, obviously, an increase in the pressure that it puts on utilities to pay up for this increased cost. And if they are not able to, and government does not have the buffer or capacity to absorb all of it, then there will be greater impact on the sector, leading to other things, including Dumsor and so on. But for now, I can't say clearly that it will happen, but it is a real possibility. You also will note the fact that because of how the changes are occurring, okay, or at least the way the conflict is going, it doesn't appear that there is a real diplomatic solution on the table, because we hear, for example, that even in Iran, there's, as at now, uncertainty as to who or which group really is in charge of the country. So even in terms of negotiations to bring about finality, there's doubts as to whether any agreement reached between, for example, the US and Israel on the one hand, and Iran leadership, that's the president, will be enough to end this conflict. So we may have to be looking at a long drawn out conflict, because there are other players who are also in the equation. Now, you know that beyond the hotspot of Iran, there's repercussions also in the sub-region, because critical infrastructure in the Middle East has been targeted in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Qatar, Oman, and so on. And we also know that other players, for example, in Yemen, like the Houthi rebels and so on, have also indicated that they'll be joining the conflict in their own, if I should say, independent, parallel ways. So it means that there are multiple dimensions to the conflict, and the possibility of it ending soon is remote. And the more remote it gets, the more the possibility of us going down that road becomes real and apparent.
So, I want you to take us through Ghana's current energy planning system. Is it robust enough to be able to withstand such prolonged instabilities around the world? How is it like?
Okay, so in terms of planning, I would say there are maybe two levels of it, or maybe perhaps even three, because we know that each of the utilities or companies or businesses that are operating in the power sector have their individual plans in terms of how they intend to basically develop or see out the year. Beyond that, we know that the system operator, which in Ghana is a Ghana Grid company, also does system planning, which takes account of the entire grid, all the players on the grid, the role they play on the grid, and how to optimize the various players and what they bring to the table as far as generation is concerned, transmission is concerned, distribution is concerned, so that at any point in time, the grid is being managed in an optimal way, balancing the various interests of the various players. But beyond that, the Energy Commission, which is the sector regulator as far as the technical aspect of the power sector is concerned, also does an outlook, energy outlook for the year, which takes account not only of what is on the grid, but the wider nation, the various resources available, and so on. So the planning process is multi-layered, as I said, from the utility level, the grid level, and the national level. And I mentioned also the fact that at the time preparations were done for the plans for this year, it is not possible for them to have contemplated such a scenario. So the plans have been done, they've been developed, they've been planned. There's projections on what to expect for 2026. But as we speak now, if this conflict continues as I've indicated, then there will be a need for revision of the plan to take account of changes that have been occasioned because of the way this conflict is going or has gone and will continue if there's no real resolution in the near future, because obviously the plan did not anticipate this conflict and how it would have affected Ghana. Prior to this conflict, we know that there was a Russia-Ukraine war. Even that had an impact, but it was less so because in the context of Russia, which is also one of the largest producers of fossil fuels in the world and exporters of fossil fuels in the world, there was sanctions on Russia in terms of the various countries or places that it could sell its fossil fuels. But as we know, even today, because of the conflict, some of those restrictions have been lifted, such that Russian oil and gas is also now available to be sold on the international market in certain respects. So those are dynamics that also affect the whole equation, because it means that there's more oil also available now than previously anticipated, because even though there's a blockage of the Strait of Hormuz and there's not export through that route, other resources have become available, as I said, through the lifting of restrictions on Russia as well. So it's a very dynamic situation, very volatile, unpredictable, and there's always a need to reevaluate. So the regulator, like the Energy Commission, needs to reconsider and recalibrate that planning process from the countrywide perspective. And obviously, the grid operator, that is GridCo, as well as the utilities in their respective companies or entities, must also recalibrate their plans and prepare more robust plans that will be resilient in the face of this conflict, especially if the conflict does not end, because it was not anticipated and that was not planned for. And the way it is going will be a real a test of how resilient these plans have been.
Talking about plans and recalibration, don't you also think that these crises have exposed Ghana's energy generation mix in terms of, we relying, or the country over-relying on thermal plants? Don't you think the crisis have sort of exposed our energy generation mix in terms of the policy governing the energy sector? Don't you think so?
Absolutely.
Or you don't consider it as a policy failure?
Absolutely, it is a policy failure, and that's one of the key things that the country needs to face head on. So, for instance, Ghana had a plan to increase renewable energy within our generation mix to 10% by 2020. Today, we are in 2026, and we don't even have up to 1% on the national grid. So already, initial targets that were set have been missed, and we failed at that. Now, after missing the 2020 deadline and projection, since then the country has developed some other goals and plans. So, for instance, there's the Renewable Energy Master Plan, which also sets that more ambitious targets of increasing renewables within the generation mix by 2030 to 20%. And here we are talking about anything that is renewable, including hydro, but less than 100 megawatts capacity. So if it is large scale, as far as the Ghana Renewable Energy framework is concerned, that is not in the bag or mix of renewable energy. That also includes a conversation around nuclear, which I'll touch on perhaps later. But as far as the policy is concerned, what we set ourselves as a target for 2020 was missed. And even currently, we are not on the path that suggests that we are able to meet our next targets either. Because, as I mentioned, now the country switched from being at its inception as a republic, from relying on hydro, Akosombo and Bon subsequently, and now has gone all the way the opposite direction to thermal, with thermal accounting for now more than 2/3 of the generation that is available within Ghana. So you can see that the policies are not working. Now, the more diversified we have a grid we have, the more resilient the grid will be, and the more resilient the country's energy security will be. Because, as I mentioned, if, for example, we are dealing with solar, the input is sunlight, which is not dependent on what happens in the Middle East. If you're talking about hydro, for example, hydro resources will be based on the availability of hydro resources within Ghana, either in terms of rivers or lakes, which is not dependent on what happens in the Middle East. If you're talking about geothermal, if you're talking about energy to waste, waste to energy, all those considerations. If you're talking about nuclear, for example, it will not be triggered by this kind of global shock. So obviously, as we stand today, there is clear evidence that there has been policy failure to make or build a more resilient energy sector in Ghana. And as we speak today, it is clear that we are still not on the path to that secure future. And so until we consciously or execute the various plans that have been developed to ensure that we diversify properly, where we can have multiple sources of generation on the national grid, the grid itself will continue to be volatile. It will continue to be susceptible to such changes, and impacts of wars and conflicts such as what is happening in the Middle East today will have a direct impact on Ghana. You see, a lot of it has been driven by the fact that plans have been basically essentially tied to megawatts. So, for example, in the last budget presented, or the 2026 budget presented by the Ministry of Finance, there is a plan to build 1,200 megawatt thermal plants. So you can see that it's all about adding megawatts, but the source of the fuel or what is going to power that plant has not been a critical consideration. Now, that 1,200 megawatt thermal plant, once it is built, will further increase the thermal generation percentage in Ghana, which means that it will increase to about 85%, almost 90% of our entire production, which means that we are heavily dependent on one type of fuel source, and that is the fuel source which is most susceptible to global price changes, which will obviously mean that our energy security will be at risk of change of being subject to changes because of this price escalation and so on. Now, beyond even the diversification of fuel sources, there are other things that we should have been working on more aggressively. Competitive procurement for power, looking at how to incorporate storage in our generation mix, grid connected storage. Not only that, even to promote domestic use of various power generating sources with storage, so that the grid can be freed up to use more of what already exists and has been produced. In terms of long-term pricing planning, how to hedge against changes in global energy prices. Beyond that, how to hedge against changes in foreign exchange prices, rates, and so on. So the focus has been on megawatts, whereas the variables are many, and diversification is a key one of them, key one of those. And until, as a nation, we structure our energy sector to be more resilient in terms of these various variables I'm talking about, it will continue to be affected by global shocks such as what is happening in the Middle East, because we don't have a diversified generation mix.
This is the Green Transition Show with me, Dr. Francis Tuokun. Our guest is Lom Ahlijah, a private legal practitioner, a consultant, and a lecturer. If you are watching us for the first time, kindly subscribe to the channel, The Green Transition Show on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, TikTok, or LinkedIn. Counsel, you've argued elsewhere in many of your writings and also on national television recently that nuclear is not just energy policy, but industrial policy. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So again, from what we've discussed so far, it is clear that we have a very volatile energy sector. Even though we don't have rolling blackouts now, we could see that because of things like what is happening now, there will be impacts directly on the country. One of the things that changes that conversation or changes the focus is nuclear energy, because nuclear energy is a more stable baseload energy generation source, which means that when nuclear is part of the conversation, we'll have a source of fuel which, in terms of pricing, is stable, generally is not as volatile as oil and gas, doesn't get traded the way oil and gas is traded. Nuclear material, which is used to generate power, is not susceptible to the kind of changes and price volatility that we experience with oil. Also, nuclear is what we term as a base load generation, because nuclear plants, when they are built and set up and switched on, essentially they remain on at the same level till till basically the plant comes to the end of its life or it is decommissioned, which means that if it is 1,000-megawatt nuclear plant producing, let's say, close to 1,000 megawatts in real time, it will be a flat generation that will run until, as I said, it is shut down or it is decommissioned. So it is a base load that gives many countries a strong foundation for your industrial growth. Because when you have a system like what we have today, where it is susceptible so much to price volatility, changes in foreign exchange rates, and so on and so forth, the global energy, oil prices changing because of conflicts and all of that, what you have is that your ability to ensure or guarantee sustainability for your sector is also tied to that volatility. Whereas nuclear will give you a base, a solid foundation, which will guarantee, let's say, stability for your sector without having to worry about that volatility. So it is industrial policy because for a country like Ghana that seeks to industrialize more, build more factories, create more jobs, ensure that we are moving from more agrarian type economy to a more industrial type economy, nuclear is one of those sources that must be part of the conversation. It must be part of the conversation because it guarantees you something that your current fossil fuel-led energy sector cannot do. Many countries have used it. The US, in many places in Europe, France, and so on, the UK, Russia, it is Japan. It is one of those things that cannot be taken out of the equation. And in fact, for Ghana, we have embarked on this journey for some time. Since 2007, Ghana has essentially taken a decision to include nuclear as part of its generation mix. And we've been going through the International Atomic Energy Agency framework to do so. But as you can see, we're in 2026. From 2007 to date, we can see how long we have come, and we are, as at now that we speak, we don't have a nuclear plant in Ghana still. Of course, the plan currently is to make sure that we can have it by 2030, or at least by 2030, one such plant should be under construction. That's the goal. Presently, 3 sites have been identified and are being evaluated, and obviously one of them will be chosen as the site for this particular nuclear plant under the framework I mentioned. So it is one of those things that we cannot avoid. We have to consider it as part of the equation. And of course, in terms of nuclear, historically, these have been large scale plants because, as I said, they usually serve as baseload for your industrial growth. But there's been a lot of research to push towards smaller nuclear reactors. So instead of having those large 3,000 megawatts nuclear plant, 2,000 megawatts and so on, lots of research is going into smaller, what they call micronuclear plants, where you can have smaller generation in smaller portions like 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt, 500 megawatts and so on. And those are being deployed in the West currently. So we wait to see what choice Ghana will make in terms of what is going to actually deploy when the final site selection is done and decisions made on what type of plant to build for Ghana as far as nuclear is concerned. But nuclear must be part of the conversation because it is the kind of power source which will give Ghana that stability whilst we continue to use thermal and hydroelectric power as those other sources which are more variable and more volatile and will be able to minimize the impact of shocks like what is happening in the Middle East on the Ghana energy sector.
Yeah, nuclear, you said nuclear is something that must be part of our energy conversation because it is what will give Ghana stability in terms of energy generation. But critics have argued that nuclear is risky, too risky, it's very expensive. How do you respond to such critics?
Well, they are right. However, we need to do some comparative analysis. First, on the issue of risk, it is true that nuclear plants are riskier than thermal plants, obviously, or any other type you can talk about. But we need to look at what is required in order to ensure that it is safe. Globally, I've mentioned several countries that have relied or used nuclear. And in terms of even impact, or in terms of, let's say, issues that have occurred in terms of nuclear plants, there are not that many relative to the number of plants out there. It's just like the conversation around, is it more risky to fly than to drive? It's true. Theoretically, it is more risky to fly than to drive. But practically or in reality, the data suggests that we have more accidents on the ground than we have in the air. So it is one of those conversations. And also, I've mentioned the fact that in order for a country to utilize nuclear for power generation, because of the global framework and the fears associated with the risks and so on, that is why the International Atomic Energy Agency exists and works with countries that intend to go that way. And I've mentioned that Ghana, for instance, has been going through the International Atomic Energy Agency framework since 2007, which means that Ghana, as a country, has been going through the framework established by the global order as far as nuclear use is concerned, so that by the time we actually have built a plant, we've ticked all the boxes. One of the so we've gone, so there are milestones that have to be met, and we are meeting them as we go along, as we aim towards our 2030 goal. It includes the kind of expertise that you must have within your country as far as training of scientists are concerned, as far as training of lawyers are concerned, as far as training of engineers are concerned. In Ghana, as I said, we have been going through that process, which means that the concerns about security have been looked at, they are being addressed, and measures are being put in place to ensure that by the time that we actually do have a plan, everything that is required or everything that we need is in place at the time. You see it? Beyond meeting the framework, we've had to even change legislation. We've passed the Nuclear Regulatory Authority Act in Ghana, for example, which is a law that sets up an authority to regulate nuclear energy. In the past, we had the Atomic Energy Agency, which obviously still exists, and so on. We have incorporated a company, the Nuclear Power Ghana, which is supposed to be the vehicle that would deploy the nuclear plants and so on. So it is about putting in the work, planning ahead, developing the competence and expertise so that the risk is minimized. Because we know for a fact that no generation source is risk-free. It is about planning to identify the risks and mitigating the risk, or putting measures in place to ensure that the risks are mitigated. So that is on the risk aspect of it. It is risky, but the risk can be managed. And globally, there's evidence that many countries have used nuclear. It has been managed without consequence, which is possible also in Ghana. Beyond the risk about the cost, nuclear plant setup and installation has the highest cost per fuel source, obviously, and that is upfront cost. It is more expensive than any other type of plant that you can put in if you are looking at the same megawatts of variables. Okay, it is true, but the upfront cost must be compared to the cost of price volatility, for example, of thermal over the life of a plant. So let's say in 30 years' time, if we invest in a nuclear power plant with high upfront costs in the beginning, say 2030, in 30 years' time, when we compare that to a plant that was also built in 2030 that was thermal, where we have to deal with price volatility and issues related to conflicts and how it impacts the oil and natural gas prices, the fact that it will affect tariffs constantly changing, the fact that there will be a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the country can expect in terms of planning and how it can throw utility financing out of gear, it can throw the national budget out of gear and so on. When we do the comparative analysis, we'll see that perhaps it will fall in favor of nuclear. But as I'm saying, these are things that we just need to ensure that we have the diversification so that when you get the benefits of the nuclear, you get the benefits of the thermal, you get the benefits of the renewables, obviously, because all the different options have their strengths and their weaknesses. And I've mentioned already the fact that for base load generation, which secures your industrial base as far as development is concerned, nuclear is the go-to source. And so we need to be careful in terms of just simply looking at the numbers. We need to look at the impact, we need to look at the effect, and so on and so forth.
Viewers, if you are enjoying the conversation, kindly share our videos, subscribe to the channel, share the videos with friends, also like and provide us with feedback so that we'll continue to improve. This is the Green Transition Show with me, Dr. Francis Tuokun. Our guest is Lom Ahlijah, a private legal practitioner in Accra, Ghana. Counsel, let me come back to you. Are there some African countries who are better positioned than Ghana at this very moment in the midst of the crisis? And why? Or how are they better positioned than Ghana? What did they get right?
Not many, actually, not many. Well, one of the ones that used to be quite good and solid was South Africa, but South Africa in recent years has had significant challenges in their power sector. Of course, I can think of, for example, a country like Kenya, where they also have a lot of geothermal power sources, which helps to diversify their countries further. But generally speaking, most African countries are not as robust because a lot of countries are dependent on fossil fuels. And so let's say, security of their energy sectors are not quite strong. In fact, recently, for example, I've seen that in Senegal, they're also having similar challenges, just like we are, because of the price volatilities in the oil and gas sector. So we don't have many African countries that are robust in that sense. You will note also, for example, that Africa as a continent is the least powered in the world. Okay, according to World Bank data and statistics, about 300 million people in Africa have no access to electricity. Of course, Ghana is one of the top performers because even for grid connection, we have about 85, 86%, which is quite high. And in the budget for 2026, the plan is to increase it to about 95%, which is very, very high in Africa. Most countries in Africa are below 50%. Even a country like Kenya, which I've mentioned that they are a bit more diversified, has still challenges because even though they have the diversified market more resilient, their power is limited to urban areas. Largely, they have less than 60% of their population having access to electricity compared to Ghana, which, as I've mentioned, is over 85%. So you see that there's a lot that is going on well for Ghana. In terms of most African countries, there's not that much to say in terms of models that we can look to. In the sub-region, for example, Ghana and Ivory Coast are the top performers when it comes to the power sector. The rest of the countries in West Africa are not anywhere close to these two countries in terms of resilience and so on. And as we have seen from what we've discussed so far, even Ghana and similarly Ivory Coast are very volatile to these shocks, obviously. So there's a lot that we need to do. I'll just say that, look, Ghana as a country needs to reconsider our policy frameworks that we have presently and be more aggressive in how to diversify and consider various options, because within the sub-region, we don't have models that we can really look up to as countries that are better positioned than us. In fact, in this particular case, is one of the situations where we need to look at the West. Obviously, we need to look at the West because the many countries in the West, whether Europe or the Americas, have a more resilient power sector. And we need to learn from them how they've done it and what we need to do to ensure that we are more secured. For example, some of the things that come to mind is about how we provide buffers, storage, fuel, how much of let's say a buffer we have if prices continue, okay, and things like that.
Okay, buffers. So talking about buffers, if I ask for your opinion on structural reforms in Ghana, and what one recommendation will you recommend to the government currently to implement in order to avoid future vulnerability?
The key reform, I would say, should be in terms of diversification. Okay. That is absolutely important because as I've indicated earlier, we started off with hydro. Hydro gave us challenges. In fact, during the 80s, there was a major drought that affected our hydro resources, which led to a study to propose reforms for the country. It is that study which recommended the need to diversify by including thermal generation, which also took quite some time to get the first thermal plants towards the late 1990s. And since then, we've continued to add thermal to the point where, as I said, the roles have now switched. Now thermal has become the dominant source and hydro the minority source. Let's put it that way. Now, what it means is that we have not learned lesson as a nation, because we've essentially moved from one type to the other without ensuring that we don't overly rely on a particular source, which is what we are doing now. Why I've said that structurally we are exposed as a nation to the volatility. So for me, the key recommendation I'll make to the government is a need to redesign the power sector to focus on diversification, and price volatility stability. In other words, we should put in place measures that ensures that we diversify and don't have to rely on one or limited options as far as the generating sources are concerned. And two, we should ensure that the design is such that it ensures price stability generally, which means that even in terms of contracting, how to hedge against changes in price, things like that, we have to include thinking around financial instruments and financial arrangements or schemes that ensure that prices are not changing that much. That way, there'll be certainty in tariffs. There'll be better clarity for industries to plan, to ensure that they can look long-term and invest in their country, invest in jobs, and so on and so forth. Without that, we'll continue to have challenges, because the central mistake that many countries have made, especially in Africa, and I've highlighted this earlier in terms of Ghana as well, is that we think only in megawatts. So we are in a rush to say, let's invest in a new plant, let's invest in a new plant. But the question is, what type of plants? What type of plant? I mentioned that for this, in the 2026 budget, we are looking at 1,200 megawatts thermal plant, which will be one of the largest plants in Ghana. It's good, but so long as it's thermal, it will be subject to the volatility. So we can continue to add thermal, obviously, but we need to start looking at the other things. And so as I've mentioned that we've already embarked on the journey to include nuclear, it means that we have to accelerate the nuclear conversation. When it comes to renewable energy, there are low-hanging fruits like solar. There needs to be policy that drives increased adoption of solar in domestic context, so that when more homes, more individuals, small companies are using such a resource, it frees up power on their grid that is already existing. Because think about it, anytime you have to add a new plant, you have to look at the impact, long-term impact, financial, environmental, and all of those things. However, if you encourage, for example, domestic use of solar, you are not adding on new plants, but you are freeing up megawatts that those same plants can generate for example, industrial use and so on, because it will take the demand away from the grid, because people are able to invest in such things at home. So there needs to be a rethink, a redesign that focuses on diversification and price stability, which means that government needs to look at incentives that encourage people to do self-generation at home, for example, using solar. Consider introduction of waste to energy schemes and programs for schools and large let's say, entities that generate a lot of those waste that can be used to generate electricity. We need to harness our wind energy potential across the country and so on, just so that at any given point in time, we have a very well-balanced generation mix that secures our energy security. And we are not overly reliant on a fuel source, which is so volatile and has direct impact from global shocks, such as the conflict in the Middle East.
Our prayer is that the parties involved in this war are able to come to the table and bring the war to an end.
Yes.
However, realistically, if the conflict or if the war persists for the next 6 months to 1 year, what does the power sector look like in Ghana?
Well, if this conflict continues for another, let's say another 6 months, that would be quite serious, because in just under a month, as I said, price of oil has gone from $70 to $110. That is not a small jump; it's a significant increase, which cannot be underestimated. So imagine in a year's time if prices continue that way. I know we've seen, for example, OPEC and other international oil producing countries saying that they intend to increase production to reduce the cost, because it's a demand and supply conversation. So long as they continue at the current supply quantities, the price will continue to go up because there will be pressure so long as the Strait of Hormuz is closed or there's limited passage, right? Yeah. However, they can also agree to increase supply so that there will be more on the market to keep the price down or low, which is also possible. But it's a geopolitical conversation. It is a diplomatic conversation. There are many interests at play. And so generally, we cannot rely on those type of approaches to show that Ghana will be secure or safe. So we really need to start thinking about measures to make our country more resilient. And as I said, the low-hanging fruits are around diversification, because to even increase, let's say, national buffer when it comes to natural gas storage or crude oil storage is significant resources we are talking about. To now build more storage facilities to be able to hold fuel for maybe beyond 90 days to 180 days, 6 months, and so on. It is investments that will take lots of money, take years perhaps to even conclude and finalize these negotiations and so on. So it is one of those situations where we are between a rock and a hard place. If it continues for another 6 months, Ghana will really be at a place where we'll be impacted significantly. The low-hanging fruit is to, as a matter of urgency, drive attention to diversification. And as I said, one of the low-hanging fruits around solar initiatives that enable homes and individuals and small businesses to move towards solar energy quickly. And we know that solar energy, in a sense, it is like the conversation we had about nuclear on the grid side. For most individuals, small businesses, even if they want it, they'll complain about the upfront cost, which means that there must be financing for it, where government has put resources available with banks or other financial institutions so that individuals who want to, for example, consider solar use at home can get financing for it quickly, so that the upfront cost is taken and then they pay over time. Those kinds of initiatives is what will really ensure a more resilient power sector. Otherwise, we are really in for quite a ride.
Okay. What is your final word?
My final word to say the powers that be in Ghana and also in many African countries is that the shocks that come from events or circumstances like what is happening in the Middle East are bound to happen. We don't have control over them, and how they will impact us also, we don't have control over it, which means that we need to spend more time and effort in planning, scenario planning, and figuring out the best ways for us to build resilient economies that will be less impacted by these global shocks. And as far as the energy sector is concerned, whether it is Ghana or any other African country, it is time to emphasize diversification and a focus on energy or fuel sources that are less volatile and less dependent on global shocks like what we see for oil and gas and so on.
Yeah. Viewers, if you have enjoyed the show, we encourage you to subscribe to the channel, share our videos with your friends and family to do the same. Comment on the videos, like them. You can also follow us on TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn, so that it will motivate us to continue to bring you more insightful topics for discussions. We thank our guest, Lom Ahlijah, a private legal practitioner in Accra, Ghana. Counsel, thanks so much for coming to the show.
Thank you so much, Doc, and all the best.
Yeah, thank you so much. We hope to see you again next time.